Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brand Your Practice podcast, where you get to learn about marketing, growing, and managing your private practice. I'm Brent Stutzman, and today we're going to be talking about this subject that is surging among private practice owners, especially group practice owners. In light of the IRS looking to hire 87,000 new agents to go tax collecting, and the topic is this: contractors versus employees. What's the difference? How can we make the right decision for our practice when we are looking to hire a contractor or an employee? Because there are risks that we need to address and risks that you need to think about. And to help me to do that today is Daniel Mayer. He is a Maryland-based attorney and the principal attorney of Mayer Law, which specializes in working with and representing mental health practitioners and mental health practices. In addition to Mayer Law, Daniel is the legal counsel for Pro Bono Counseling, a Maryland nonprofit that connects uninsured and low-income Marylanders with therapists on a volunteer basis at no cost. Daniel is also the legal counsel for the Maryland Counseling Association, which is the trade organization for Maryland licensed clinical therapists. And Daniel also has a podcast where he co-hosts called the Protecting Your Practice podcast, which focuses on the legal, ethical, and compliance considerations practitioners and practices need to be considering. Dan is also married to a forensic psychologist who owns a large group practice that operates in multiple states. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Wow, that sounds much more impressive, like when you're reading it, than I think about it in my head.
Well, hey, I'm glad you're with us to discuss this. And before we jump in, is there anything that could be helpful for our listeners to know about you,
Sure,
other than the introduction that I just gave?
I am a Ravens fan and a Giants fan. Does that count? Or, are you talking more clinical, like by practice-based? No, practice-based, my practice is focused, as you said, on working with practitioners. The topic we're talking about today comes up a lot. Especially when you have a practitioner who started or owns a practice and then decided they want to move to the group model. That's one of the first questions they have is, well, should I be doing a W-2? Should I be doing a 1099? How should that work? Things like that. So this is one of those topics where it's very near, or if not at the top of the list of questions and topics we cover with practitioners who have group practices or want to start group practices. And it's also ongoing.
Yeah,
like there's never an end to this discussion, right? As you add people and things like that, this question always comes back up.
Yeah. And for a lot of practice owners, you probably started off with contractors, right? It's the safest, it's the easiest, low risk. But as you start to grow and you start getting into the labor laws and reading some of the fine print, you're like, well, maybe that's not the best option, because we often, as we might find out, we often treat contractors like employees, and that's a big no-no when it comes to the IRS.
I find with the practices I work, it's almost like an organic thing, right? The practices that do it best are the ones that it happens organically, right? I agree with you that when you're starting off this group practice, contractors can be the easiest model to use, but there is an organic growth to it, and there does reach a point, and I've talked to enough practitioners who have confirmed this for me, that when they're talking to their accountants and things like that, they're talking to me, that there comes a point where it doesn't make as much sense to have the contractor. It may not be the safest model to have the contractor, and to grow further, the contractor is not the right model for them anymore. And so they either start to convert those contractors to W-2 employees, or they start hiring W-2 employees.
Right. Yeah, and there's lots of reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that, as you grow group practice, you actually want to control the culture more, and you
Correct.
want people to come to staff meetings, and you want to have more demands on their time, and that's where you really start to cross that line over from contractor to employee, and that's just not sustainable, especially kind of those larger, philosophical reasons of why starting a group practice.
Yeah, I think the culture, that's a big deal, right? Because if you're building a practice where it's vibrant and you want people to like being there, loyalty is important, because if you're putting time, resources, and hiring, a lot of practices that I work with often may have one or two or three in Maryland we call them graduate professional counselors, or graduate licenses, right? People have just graduated to have some sort of provisional license. The idea would be, if you're training this person, if you're doing supervision for this person, the ideal is to have this person grow up through your practice and really stay there. Well, to get that loyalty, to get that retention, a contractor is not always going to cut it. So if you're investing all this time and resources in really developing a great workplace, you want someone who's going to be loyal and someone who's investing in your practice. Contractors, as I'm sure we'll discuss, for a number of reasons, don't have that, right? But with employees, you certainly can.
Yeah. So the way so our listeners know, the way we're kind of framing this podcast episode is, first, we're going to talk about contractors, employees in broad strokes, so we kind of get the groundwork. Mm-hmm. And then second, I think it'd be important to know just upfront, what are the financial risks for the practice owner if they misclassify a contractor when they should really be an employee. And then we have a document that we're going to kind of just work through what the IRS uses, the Common Law Test, to determine if your contractor should be classified as an employee, and just kind of work through it's a bigger document. And I'm going to have something on our website, on Brand Your Practice website, where you can download this. It's like a little checkbox, It's like, it might be an employee if, and you can determine for yourself. So why don't you just, Dan, if you could, just in broad strokes, from a practice owner's financial perspective, like, what's really the difference between a contractor and an employee?
Yes, this is why I love talking about this. So when talking about this topic with my clients or prospective clients, I like to stress right off the bat to clinicians that the very term, the name itself, tells you something about what's happening with an independent contractor, for example, right? And a contractor is an independent worker, right? You're hiring them to do a specific task or job. And typically when we talk about contractors, we're talking about someone who can work for whoever they want. They can't be restricted. I say they are independent, right? Now, they may have their own business, their own LLC, right? Or they may be by themselves, but they are independent of your business. With employees, it's more, you're hiring someone who's going to be long-term, maybe a permanently employed member of your staff. They can be on payroll. They can receive benefits. You can set their schedule. You cannot set the schedule of a contractor. And you do have a large degree of control over the work, how they work, when they work, and that type of thing. In states like Maryland, where I am, that are at will, that means you can hire and fire at will, and they can also quit at will. And you can also then have restrictive covenants such as non-competes and things like that. And they're also typically, employees tend to have a lot more rights when it comes to discrimination, labor laws, and certain pay and leave entitlements. So it's really serious, and it's really a big deal, the difference between contractors and employees, and why you don't want to mix these up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, like, one of the things that some people don't realize is that with employees, there's more financial cost to the practice owner. So you're covering 7.5% of the payroll tax. There's this is the other crazy thing I didn't know about this until I had my own employees, is the unemployment insurance.
Social Security, all that stuff, right? With contractors, it's, I'm paying you to do X, right? Great. Now the rest of it's on you. Like, you've got to pay your own taxes. You've got to pay your own benefits if you want them. If you have your own contractors or employees for your own sub business, right? You're responsible for all the costs associated with that, right? Employees, typically, you're going to take on a lot of those costs as an employer. Yeah.
Before the show, we were talking about, like, a contractor. Think of it as like a contractor, like a plumber.
I love this.
So if you need, So if you want, go ahead and dive into that metaphor a bit for us.
Yeah. I actually do use the plumber. I use painter sometimes. What I want those listening to think of is, think about your house. Think about what happens when you have a leaky faucet, right? Or think about it when you want to have your house painted. What do? Do you hire someone to work for you as your employee? No, right? Maybe someone gives you a referral or something, and someone comes out in a truck, and they might have their own company, right? And they say, okay, what do you need done? Here's what I need done. Great. Here's what it's going to cost. We'll get to work and we'll get it done. They already have the training, they already have the experience, they likely already have the tools, right? And they're not working for you for years on end or months on end. They're doing this project and then they're gone, right? And while they're working for you, they may be working for 10, 20, 30, 40 other people. If they have a large company, it could be, hundreds of people that clients they have at any one time they're servicing. And that's why I think it's such a great analogy, because that's an example of when you're hiring a clinical contractor, right? Essentially, that's what you're doing. You're hiring someone to do a specific job, not plumbing, but maybe provision of therapy. And you're paying them a very specific rate or amount to do that job. And they could be working for 3 other company practices. They can do, have their own employees or contractors, and typically when you hire that plumber, you're signing some sort of financial document, right? I agree that, you're going to give me these services and I'm going to pay you X, sign. Well, the same things with clinical contractors, right? Typically you should have, I want to say this because some people don't think that they don't, and I've seen this happen, but in my opinion, you should always have a contract when you have a clinical contractor, detailing what exactly the relationship is and what's supposed to happen and what's supposed to be paid.
Right. Like, if you can take the plumber experience longer, it's not like you have a leaky faucet and it's sort of like, okay, I want you to fix this faucet, but I want you to come around, and every day for the next 3 years, and I'm just going to have you do all these little things. I'm going to give you I'm going to give you your own family email address.
Correct.
So, and you start to, and you know what? I'm actually going to provide, I got a set of plumbing tools that I'm going to let you use to do all this work.
And by the way,
because I prefer these tools.
And by the way, I'm a plumber too, and I'm going to teach you how the best way to do the plumbing job that I'm hiring you to do. So sit on down, I'm going to teach you all about plumbing, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I encourage those listening to try that with the plumber that you hire and see how that response is going to go.
That's right. That's right. And you know what? We have meetings every Wednesday with our family. Right. And you're going to join those. Sure. You know what? And I'm actually going to buy food for you as well. I'm going to provide lunch and food and pay for all that. And if you have to, if you want to go learn something, I'm going to reimburse you for that stuff too. So
and when you want vacation,
listeners,
and don't forget the vacation, right? Right? Oh, you want to go on vacation? Right. I got that covered for you. Don't worry.
That's right. But you can only take it for 2 weeks,
right?
during this month, right? So the reason why we're laughing a little bit is because this is a topic that I think we really need to get right as practice owners. Sure. And so the more you kind of think like the plumber, and then how you treat your contractors in your practice, we're starting to blur that line a lot, because a lot of practice owners do that. They'll provide lunches, they'll provide tools, Correct. They'll provide all those things for their contractors. And as the IRS is going to look at that contractor, say you get audited, those things are going to come up, and they're going to be like, this person's actually more like an employee. Now, let's talk about the number 2 thing, which
can I add one comment? Can I just add one comment?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
To those listening, you may be saying, well, of course I know, I get what you're saying, or I know a little bit about this, so of course I'm not going to give them benefits. Okay, but are you going to give them an email address? Are they going to have an office that they're going to be working in your office? Are they going to have internet access in that office? So some of these are fine. It's okay to do, as we'll probably discuss. But the point is it's a slippery slope, right? It's very easy to start slipping into that mode of blurring those lines. And that's where the danger, I think, to your point is.
Yeah. Even so far as having their name, picture on your website. So would you actually, if you had a family website or whatever, would you put your plumber on that, right?
But I really like him or her.
Yeah, they feel like they're a part of the family. So that's another thing, because to the outside, they may not look. They looks like a part of the team, part of the employee. So, all right. So I'd love for you to walk us through a little bit. Okay, what are the financial risks of a practice owner if they misclassify a contract?
Okay. So one of the things that I get from people is, okay, so, I have to do this right, okay, and how do I know? Are they going to, are they looking over my shoulder? How do I know when I'm getting in trouble, right? And typically, I think filing your taxes or things like that can honestly trigger the audit or trigger a look into it. But it can also be, and this has happened with clients of mine, where somebody wasn't clear, somebody goes and files for unemployment. And then suddenly the state is like, what's going on here? right? And that's when the attention kind of zooms in on you. So the simple answer is if you're caught and you're found to have misclassified an employee, and what we're talking about misclassification, what we're saying is you have somebody that, let's say the state or federal government says, IRS says, you know what, we think this person is an employee, but you are treating them as a contractor. That's that's what we mean by misclassification. And so essentially the problem here for practices is that if you are found liable, you could owe a lot of money, right? It can be very financially expensive for you. You may be liable for paying outstanding monies, monies, I should say, like employment taxes, Social Security, any other fees, outstanding pay, unpaid overtime. So it could be a small amount, or it could be a really huge amount, depending on how.
So let's say the contractor makes like $100,000 a year, right? If a contractor makes $100,000 a year at your practice, you're looking at paying like what, 1 or 2 years worth of that 7.5%,
Sure.
Any overtime, all that.
Think about the overtime, right? Overtime is anything that's over, well, Maryland, for example, anything that's over 40 hours. So if over the course of a year that person has worked, multiple times a week, over 40 hours, and all of a sudden they come back and say to you, hey, by the way, you now owe overtime for this entire past year, that's a lot of money. And that's
on top of the unemployment tax.
Correct. Unemployment, Social Security. It is not an understatement to say that if a practice messes this up badly enough, and not even that badly, it could bankrupt a practice.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that's what I want to make sure that
Ken.
everyone listening is like, it's not like, okay, I pay $3,000, I'm done. It's not like that. You're lucky if that's what it is.
Right. Tens of thousands of
Correct.
dollars is probably what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And how far can the IRS potentially go back
So
and say all these years?
So, I've always said to my clients, right, to be on the safe side, is you should be able to document and justify. I say 10 years, right, to be on the safe side for my clients, right, because you have ample documentation at that point, in my opinion. And I tend to be more conservative, so I tend to say to my clients, do this, to exhaustively if you can. Since most people are using a payroll system, they're using some sort of financial, I don't want to say, I guess, processing system to pay, to collect fees.
Like QuickBooks or
Correct.
Gusto or something like that.
It's not that hard to do that, to store this information, and as long as you're doing it right. So I am saying be a little more exhaustive, so that if something comes up, you can be like, boom, here's everything I have, and here's it all in order.
Yeah. So but as far as the IRS, like, could they say, hey, this person's been a contractor for 5 years. They've really been an employee. You have to owe unemployment for or like payroll taxes and all that for the last 5 years.
Yeah, so they can absolutely. Yeah, they can come back and say, "Here's the time range that we found that you have, that you've not done this correctly, and you're now on the hook for all the money for all of those years."
I can think about, that would just do.
And that's not just IRS.
Practice it.
Maryland, like the state can do it too.
Then their state.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So that's
We're
the
in
other
Illinois.
thing.
I'm in Illinois.
Right.
Heck yeah, they're coming after.
Oh yeah, Maryland loves to get Maryland loves to get paid, right? All the government loves to get paid. So if the IRS does this and then it triggers an investigation, it's possible, it's likely that the state might also. And if you violate on one level, it's very likely then you're going to have violated on the state level too, and vice versa. So I think we both are hammering point home to those listening is this is really serious, right? And there's two things I always tell people who have a group practice that you must have: an accountant and a lawyer.
That's right. And good contracts.
Right. Well, that's the thing, right? The
drawn up by the lawyer,
right? And an accountant who's keeping tabs on everything and making sure everything's being done right.
Yeah. So I imagine, for the people listening, okay, they're like, all right, I have to make some changes. And here's the thing I go back to, as I've been understanding this myself for my clients, and help my clients process this, like the cost benefit analysis compared to what you're at risk and liable for, it makes a lot more financial sense to just have them as an employee. Because if they're an employee, the IRS is like, that's they're satisfied in a lot of ways that way because they're collecting the payroll tax. The government's getting paid. So you have a lot more flexibility with an employee and lower, less liability when it comes to all those back taxes and everything else than you would have to with a contractor.
I agree, and I think that's why I was saying it earlier in the show. When it comes to practices that are growing, there is a reason. This is one of the reasons why it's not uncommon. In fact, it's very common that practices will start to migrate to a W-2 model, employee model from contractors as they grow, because it just becomes too cumbersome. There's too much needs the practice has. It's safer. It's far safer. And again, as we mentioned about the culture, so it just becomes an easier model. I do think that there is merit, and I agree with it, that if you're a solo practice owner and you're saying to yourself, I want to get started and start having more people work for me, sure, I can see and understand, and there are ways to do it, to have a contractor, 2 contractors, 3 contractors, right? There's ways to do that, and that's fine, right? It does make sense early on, but I do think that as time goes on and as your practice thrives and you make more money, you're going to have to go the model of the employee at some point.
Yeah. Before we jump into the third thing, as we kind of walk through the common law test a bit, could the IRS also go after the contractor itself and inflict penalties on them?
Sure. So the thing about that is, if the contractor, right, is responsible for paying taxes, or paying whatever local, state, local, federal fees, taxes that are owed, and they're not paying those, and the IRS or the state is investigating, and they say, well, look, in addition to the practice not paying what we're owed, you, the contractor, didn't pay us what was owed. Absolutely, I think it could trigger it. It's not, as those listening are probably hearing, it is not a good situation all around. And the best cure to that, the best cure to that is from the very get-go. This is not an area you should never cut corners, and this is one of the areas that you should absolutely never cut corners. You need to be crossing your T's and dotting your I's at all times, and that's why I say, and I say this on my own podcast, because we talk about compliance. This is why you must, and I'm not saying you should, I'm saying you must. You want to have a practice, especially a group practice, you must have an attorney. You must have an accountant. They often do work or talk to each other. There is some overlap, but you must be doing this because, as you said, the state and the federal government, if they think they're owed money, they're going to get their money.
Yeah. Now with the IRS, looking to hire a few extra 1,000 people to look into this even more. So
correct. Now's the time to start figuring this out. Right, correct.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, now you got to start doing your due diligence here. Okay, so let's jump into the third section of this podcast. Is the IRS uses a common law test to determine if your contractor should be classified as an employee. And this test looks like 3 factors to help businesses determine whether or not a worker should be classified as an employee or a contractor. And again, we're going to have a breakdown of this on a PDF that you can download on our website at brandyourpractice.com. And so there's really kind of 3 major areas, and I'll just do a quick overview of this, Daniel. There's the 3 is the behavior control, financial control, and then the type of the relationship. So, Daniel, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and start with the behavioral control.
Sure. Let me put my professor hat on and start my lecture. No. When I talk to clients about this, I break it down into 2 or 3 points per section here, right? Behavioral control refers to what you, the practice owner, controls, right? What control do you as an employer have over your staff? This includes where and when the work is performed, what tools are being used, how's the purchasing of supplies happening, who's doing it, and what and how the work to be performed is to be done. Right? Is there on-the-job training? Are there systems? So if you're saying, look, in order to to be a clinical therapist for me, who's a contractor, you need to know how to use simple practice. So here's an overview of simple practice. That's different than, hey, you have no idea how to do therapy, so I'm going to teach you how to be a clinical therapist right now, right? It's very different types of training. So if you're just training on how to use the systems to do the job, or are you providing training on how to actually, do the job in general?
Right.
One example I see of this that practices fall into or kind of run into is when I have a clinician tell me that they want to have someone available to work for them on evening or weekend hours. And they say, great, so can I hire a contractor to do that? And I'm like, I guess if the contractor wants to, but can you tell them? No, you cannot. And that's the problem. To your point a minute ago, is as you're expanding and now you have 100 clients, 200, 300 clients a week that you're seeing, you're likely going to have clients who have needs for evening and weekend appointments. And so you're going to need to be able to set a schedule and have someone available to work those hours. And that's not going to be a contractor unless, again, they want to. But if you want someone to set those hours, that's an employee. You're setting their schedule, you're dictating when and how they work. Yeah, that's what I would say about that. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and to that point, I've been thinking through an example for one of my clients is like, okay, we want to move everyone, we're moving people to employees or even salaried from W-2 part-time or whatever to salary. But they said, well, there's a couple contractors, they want to be contractors, but they, the practice has some availability on the weekends that nobody's working. So I said, well, what if the contractor wants to say, hey, if you want to work at the practice, we only have weekends available. If you want those hours, you can have those. And then we just draw that up in the contract saying, is that like an okay, because the understanding with the contractor, like we're not telling them when to work, but.
I that makes me queasy still. Because you're not, I would question as to whether you're really giving that contractor a choice, right? If they want to work for you, you're saying, well, great, if you want to work for me, these are the hours I have available. Okay? So you're actually sort of setting those hours for them indirectly. Right? And that would make me somewhat concerned. One of the things that I really want to stress here for everyone listening is what we're saying today. And when you consult with an attorney about this or in general, there's no one-size-fits-all rule here. That's what, and the IRS doesn't even apply one-size-fits-all. They're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So that's the case here, too, with this particular question is, I would say, as, we joke in the legal world, a lawyer's favorite word is depends. It depends, right? Right? I would be queasy about someone putting in a contract, you are going to work these hours, right? For a contractor, that is, right? Instead, it may be that you're going to work and do 15 clinical hours minimum. Great. Okay. I'll pay you X amount of percentage of the hours you work. Great. What hours you want to work? I want to work on the weekends and evenings. Perfect. I have availability then. Let's have you do that, right? The contractor has very clearly, in that case, made the decision, in my opinion. It's one of those things where it's a very fine line, but I think it's one that's very important.
Yeah, good. That's helpful. I mean, I know like private practice also have to provide couches and chairs and for the office, all those things. So in some ways you're providing some things for the contractor. I'm curious in your conversation with practice owners, where would you say like, okay, do your best to not provide these things in the office setting for your contractors?
I'll give you an example. So to your point about couches, right? I think of it as like this. If you have an office, you're going to have electricity. You're going to have internet at the office. By nature, you're going to have offices, if you have them, right, with a desk, probably a chair, okay? Just by nature of the fact that you have an office and you have people working there, employees, whoever, that's just going to be there, right? So if someone, a contractor comes to your office and says, I'm going to sit over here at this desk and I'm going to sit here in this office and see this client on this couch. Okay, right? You're not, in my opinion, you're not directly providing that contractor that, right? That's something that the office is going to have in general, okay? Where I've seen the problems that come up for me is where then I talk to a client and they're like, well, we have a supply closet, and whenever the contractor or anyone in the office needs something, they can go get paper, they can go get pens, they need a laptop, so we help them get a laptop. And I'm like, no, 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 no. We need to stop that right now. Like, you cannot be doing that. If I'm a contractor and I'm coming to do clinical work, I need to have my own laptop, right? I need to have my own pens. I need to have my own computer bag. I can use the office internet. Sure, I'm going to be using the simple practice or whatever the EHR that the practice has, of course. I may connect to the printer if I need to print something out, but you need to be very careful about what you're providing specifically that practitioner, right? And I think that's the key, is it's specifically versus the entire broad office. Right? Mm-hmm. If you happen to have a conference room and there's donuts in there, hey, everyone, I brought donuts in this morning, and your contractor walks by and just grabs one, that's okay. I'm not that concerned about it. But if you're saying your contractor,
no,
don't touch that donut, you're a contractor. No. But if it's like, okay, contractors, I'm going to bring lunch every day for you, that makes me very concerned. Right? That's the difference. See, and it's a fine line. Right, and it's very easy to blur those lines, and it's very easy for a well-meaning practice, to start mixing these up.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Is there anything else around behavioral control you want to address? Because I have a couple other things, but I think we can move on to the next one if you don't have anything else.
One thing I would just say to everyone is behavior control is, what is the nature of the behavior? What's happening with this contractor, right? What's happening with this employee? What's the control like? I don't want to say relationship, because that's one of the other points, but it's about the behavior aspect. And that's where I'll leave it, I guess. Okay, great.
Well, let's jump into the next one, the financial control. If you kind of give an overview of that, and we can dive in.
So at face value, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's about money and financing and the financial control here, right? So it's really as to what, whether the practice owner has the right to control what we call the economic part of that worker's job, right? So this includes, how are they paid, right? Whether expenses are reimbursed, who's providing the tools and supplies, what's the opportunity for profit or loss? That's a big one. Right? Expenses, again, could be CEUs, travel costs, business costs, cell phones, internet, right? If your contractor says, all right, I need to have 20 CEUs for my license this year, right? Great, I'll cover those for you. No, you won't. That's a business expense of the contractor. The contractor needs to cover that expense. But for an employee, sure. Right? That's not unusual. That's a very nice gesture towards your staff to say, hey, everyone, we'll cover your CEUs. Or there's a conference in California, we're going to pay for everyone's cost to go to that conference to get these CEUs. As an employee, you can do that. As a contractor, you cannot. Okay? Regarding profits and loss, and what I mean by the opportunity for profits or loss, for example, if a contractor doesn't show up to do the work, they don't get paid. Right? If you're a plumber, let's go back to the plumber. If you're like, all right, plumber, I need you to fix my sink today, and they don't show up, you're not giving them payment because they didn't show up. Right? If they show up, you did the work, I pay you, right? So in Maryland, for example, this might be a contractor who gets paid a percentage of each session or each hour that they work, right? If they don't come to work that day, they're not getting paid that percentage because they didn't do the work. Employees, though, may take a sick day, right? If you have employees and you provide paid sick leave, right? If they're like, I'm going to call out today, I'm really under the weather. Great, I don't want you coming in my office anyway. Don't get us sick. But it's a paid day. So they didn't do any work, but they're still getting paid, right? Also, we're talking about things like bonuses, right? End of the year. We did great. It was a wonderful year. Everyone worked really hard. Everyone's getting a $1,000 bonus. Great. You cannot do that for a contractor, right? The contractor, the contract says, I'm going to pay you X amount of whatever for the services, the clinical therapy. That's what you're paying them, right? You can't be giving them.
Because it's outside that contract,
yeah, and that's
right?
What I
the
say.
Agreed terms.
I say that to practitioners. The contract is what rules. It's a contractor, an independent contractor. It's right there in the name. I also think this extends to the competition, right? Because the ability of someone to make money. You can control that if it's an employee. A contractor, you cannot restrict or control. You can't say, sorry, you can only work for me, you cannot compete with me. If I'm a contractor, and the reason some people like the contractors is because I can work for 3 practices part-time, or generally I think realistically no one's going to be working for 3 practices full-time. I think that's an impossibility, but you can work for multiple practices as a contractor. With an employee, you can absolutely say, as part of your employment here, we restrict your employment. You may not work for any other practice while you are working here, or for a period of, however many years after you leave, or whatever it is. You can put those restrictive covenants and restrict the ability of the employee or that staff member to get paid for their skills. You can't do that with a contractor.
Oh, man. Okay, 2 questions. So you can actually then enforce or say have a contract, like a no solicitation.
I love this question. I love it.
Or non-compete when it comes to employee contracts.
I love this question because this is something that I get a lot. And so my answer to you is yes. On that end, I do agree, right? You can have a contractor and say, while you're working here, please, you may not solicit my staff to go work for your separate business, right? It's not uncommon for contract therapists to often have a side therapy practice themselves, right? So, it's not a terrible idea always to have something in place that says, look, while you're working here, you can't be encouraging my staff to leave to go to your practice, or my clients, the clients are coming to our practice here to leave you, right? But you can't put that non-compete in place, right? You can't do that. With an employee, you can absolutely put both in. Right, you can have a non-solicit, you can have a non-compete, right? You can set it for a certain period after for the duration of employment and after the employment ends, right? It's a fine line, right? It's something you have to be careful of. In Maryland, it's always a reasonableness factor, right? If it's unfairly prejudicial against the one party, it's not going to hold up no matter what you put in there, right? In some jurisdictions don't even allow non-competes anymore. So that's another thing to be aware of, is what is your jurisdiction saying when it comes to non-solicits, non-competes, things like that.
What would be an unfairly restrictive non-compete?
So I've seen this, right? Someone brought it to me once. It's like, this is what I want to do. And I'm like, nope, we're not doing this. And what it was the person said, okay, within a period of 5 square miles of my office, you cannot compete for 5 years. And I went to them, I said, that's completely unacceptable. It's not going to fly. They could challenge this. And the reason is, look, right now, if I walk outside your door, down the street, you have at least 5 different therapy practices probably already operating in the area. So the idea that this person is going to leave and somewhere in this next 5 square miles that they're going to open up a shop and it's going to affect your bottom line, that's not accurate. That's not real. That's not legitimate, and it's not realistic. And 5 years is a long time to restrict someone's ability to not work. That's the thing about non-compete you have to be very careful of. Non-compete means they can't compete with you. If I'm a therapist and I'm doing therapy for you and I leave and I have a non-compete, I can't do therapy for a certain period of time or for a certain geographic range. That's a problem. So if you're really restricting this person's ability to work, that's going to be questioned. But if you say, look, I'm not going to challenge your ability to work for another practice, just please don't work in the building next to mine, which that's something that actually happened with one of my clients as well. So it has to be reasonable. Right, I generally tell clients when they're leaving in Maryland, if they have practitioners who are leaving or they're signing non-competes, is you really don't need a geographic restriction, because the reality is in the Baltimore area there's tons of practices and the need is abundant.
Really dense.
Every practice I know has a waiting list, right? So if someone leaves, it's likely they're not going to really hurt your bottom line unless they solicit or take your clients or employees. That's where the impact can really come in, and that's where, again, you can have that in place, but that also has to be reasonable too, right? If I'm like, I leave your practice and 10 years later, I talk to one of your employees about, what I'm doing, and they're like, that's great, I want to come over. Sorry, you signed a 10-year non-solicit. I think that would be questioned as well. I think that's really unreasonable.
Okay, so when it comes to soliciting, and thank you listeners for hanging in. I hope this is a good conversation. Now I'm just getting really curious. So when it comes to soliciting clients, so what's a reasonable, like, hey, if you're leaving the practice, you can't solicit your clients to come with you to the next class. Is that a thing? Like, can you actually have that in non-solicitation?
So I want everyone listening, because I know that you are going to agree with me on this, okay? The reality of the mental health world, reality of healthcare world, is that clients and patients will go where they want to go. Clients in the therapy world, they develop bonds and relationships with their therapists. And let's be honest here, if someone is saying, I'm leaving this practice to go down the street to start my own, and that client's like, I have a great relationship, I love working with you, you've been so helpful to me, it's not undue, like, distance-wise for me to go to you. You're not, like, charging $500. You know, maybe you take insurance too. You know, it's not that hard for me to switch over to your practice. They're gonna leave. And in my opinion, there's really nothing a practice can do. Clients always have the right to make a healthcare decision, in my opinion, right? So when we talk about solicit, what we're really talking about is, in my opinion, it's really, really outward, like, blatant soliciting, right? Hey, listen, I'm leaving the practice. I want you to come with me, right? You know, don't worry about, you know, so-and-so owner. Like, just come with me, and we'll have you, you know, come over and you can start working with me. Now, some practice owners I talk to don't care about that, right? They're like, great, no problem. I want the client to be treated. If they feel like they have a great rapport with that person, by all means, take them with you. But I'm of the mindset that when a client comes into a practice, signs your informed consent, fills out all the paperwork, while they may be working with that clinician at that practice, the reality is, if you ask that client, who are you a client of, right? Not the therapist, but who are you a client of in general? Oh, well, I'm a client of ABC Therapy. Yeah, and you are. And you signed ABC Therapy's informed consent. So I'm inclined to think that you are a client, that person is a client of that practice. The best way I advise practitioners who are leaving a practice, and this has come up, is you say, look, to do this as neatly and cleanly as possible, have a conversation with the practice you're leaving. Figure out what are some talking points that you mutually can agree to that would make sense for you to talk to the client about. Hey, I'm leaving. Of course, you can always make any decision you want, but I'd ask you just to have a conversation with the front office. And they can have a talk with you about whether you want to stay and be transferred to someone else in the office, or if you want to leave, they can give you my information as well as 3 or 4 other people in the community. But just have that conversation with the office. And I just wanted to let you know that I am leaving, and I've been really grateful to have this time together. However you want to phrase it, right? You do that, yeah. There's no issues with solicitation, in my opinion. There's not an argument that can be made that you solicited someone at that point.
Yeah. And like, this is always like the sticking point, right? Because you want to be able to protect the financial aspect of your business. So there's that. But you don't want to burn bridges. So if somebody's leaving, and I've seen this enough with working with practice owners, like, if you're listening and thinking about leaving, having that conversation that Daniel just have is amazing, because you could go to them and say this way. You could have this. You could say, look, here's a roster of all my clients. These 10, they're ready to terminate within the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to work on terminating them. Here are some other ones that I think could be a really good fit for other people in the practice that I'd love to transfer them over, connect. There's these 5 or 6 who are just in critical work, and we've been doing some deep work, and referring them elsewhere probably isn't best for the client. Could I potentially talk to them and having them stay with me or something like that? Man, I tell you, that would be a game changer for the practice owner and for you, and just being able to do that, leaving well. And I would remind people listening that when you leave a practice, if you leave on good terms, it's very likely that you will be a referral source for that practice. If you burn that bridge, you are burning that referral source for you. And if you're starting your own practice, that is one of the worst things you can do, because you're looking to get clients. The other thing I'll say that you didn't mention is that when it comes to clients, when a practitioner goes through the practice and says, here's the list of the clients I've been seeing, one of the things that you can do that's really impressive and that's really helpful and beneficial to the clients is to figure out who are the high-risk ones.
if you're someone who's in an area like trauma, PTSD, something where you're working with people who are severely depressed or have a high risk of self-harm, right? If you are like, look, I'm leaving in 30 days, okay, great. Well, those are people who have a critical need, likely, for clinical therapy, clinical services right away. Whereas if you've been seeing someone once a month and they're great, they made a huge amount of progress. Now they're just kind of occasionally talking things out, and it's maintenance, essentially. It's a less risk client. You're also now giving the practice an opportunity to help make sure that there's a continuum of care here. You're helping your clients that way. You're helping figure out who are the ones who need to be transferred right away. If I can't take them, who can? Right? And I think when you do that, it really goes a long way with that practice.
Yeah. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed that mini episode within this larger episode on how to leave a practice well. Okay, one last question, and then we'll move on to the third one. The other one that I wanted to talk about was, okay, you talked about if somebody doesn't show up, that contractor doesn't get paid, right? The client doesn't show up, the contractor doesn't get paid for that missed appointment. What if it's somebody who's paid, it's an employee, comes to work, is there, the client, but it's an employee that's not salary, but it's a percentage kind of split. They get a percentage of that appointment fee. They work that hour, but the client's not there, but they're there at the office. Do you have to compensate them for that hour that they're there at the office, but the client didn't show up?
I want to be careful here, because I always want to say that it's going to be based in part on your jurisdiction.
It depends.
Right? It depends. But I would say in Maryland, I would say that, well, there's a likelihood that you may still be you're likely going to have to pay that person. Why? Because they were there in the office still working, right? So if the person says, well, look, I caught up on my notes and I made some other appointments, I had time to spare, so I made some callbacks and, I set up 3 or 4 more appointments for me this week. They're doing work in the office. And I think that it's a risky thing to say, well, you didn't do it, the client canceled, so I'm just not going to pay you. To my ears, just saying that doesn't sound right. That doesn't feel good, and it doesn't sound right. And I would tell people that, I'm not saying the gut check is the only thing you should do, but if your gut's like, that doesn't feel right, that oftentimes is an inkling that there's something off there, and you probably shouldn't do that, or you're not doing something right.
Yeah, because you think if you're like a Starbucks employee and you're there at the office, and they're like, well, there hasn't been anyone here for an hour, and the business is like, well, you're not getting paid for that hour. You're like, what?
Well, you're right, exactly. To use our example before, if I have a company and I have a car wash or I have Starbucks and employees are walking around, it's a slow day, right? Yeah, well, guess what? That's the thing about employees. The long term, to those who are listening, I would just say to you, if this is something you're thinking about, the reason why employees are still beneficial is because in the long term, that person is going to still be loyal to you, right? That person is committed to your practice. You're giving them the opportunity to have sick leave, 401k, whatever it is. So why should I still? Well, why would I want to have an employee? Because in the long term, they're going to make you more money, even when things like this happen.
Yeah. Oh, this is great. Okay, let's jump to the third and final one, the type of relationship.
Okay. So, I would remind everyone listening, an independent contractor is somebody who's independent and who signs a contract. We are talking about the relationship here when we start talking about stuff like this. So type of relationship refers to how do the employee and employer think about the relationship, right? Is there a contract or is it strictly at will? And by the way, you can have employment with contracts and still be employment at will. I'm not even going to get into that, but just so that is still an at-will employment arrangement. How long is the relationship for? Is it ongoing? Congratulations, you're hired as my therapist, so you're here until I fire you or you quit, right? Or is it, here's your contract, and it renews year to year, and as long as we both agree, it'll continue to renew, or maybe this is for a year, and at the end of the year, it just terminates, right? That's very specific, terms that govern what the relationship is and how that works. Are there benefits, including disability, 401k, sick leave? Who pays for that? right? Is the contractor paying for it for themselves, or is it something that the employer, the practice, is paying for? And that's what we're talking about. I would also throw in loyalty, right? We talked about restrictive covenants, including non-competes, right? This is one of those things where, as an employer, if you're my employee, I have the right to restrict your work. I have the right to set your hours. I have the right to tell you when you're going to work and what you can and cannot do, right? I have a handbook maybe, right? As a contractor, you may have policy procedures for the office, but the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, you come in, you do your work, you leave, right? You can go, then maybe you leave and go to the practice down the street, right? The relationship, what is defining it? How is it defined? That's what we're looking at here.
Got it. And where do you see practice owners usually crossing that line with
Sure.
contractors?
So we mentioned one already, and that is, I think, in terms of blurring the line between employers and contracts, right? Okay, guys, so we're going to have a meeting today. Everyone needs to be there, or hey, I brought food in for the office. Contractors, I'm going to pay for your lunch today. Or hey, everyone, here's a bonus for the holidays, right? And if you're listening to this, you're thinking, well, seems like some crossover between the three. There is. Right, there is, absolutely. But I had this happen with a practice, right, where a practice came to me and said, okay, so we have this person who left and they are filing for unemployment. Okay, great. So how long have they been employed for? Well, they're not. They're a contractor. Okay, that's weird. Where's the contract? Well, we never had one. Okay, well, that's a problem because... right? IRS in Maryland are going to say, so you didn't have a contract and this person's filing for unemployment, right? That's a big warning red light. And it's because that relationship was not defined as in the contract, right? So the question is, well, if they're not a contractor, right, then aren't they, what makes them not a W-2 employee? Right? That's where I see it, is it's usually in defining that relationship and blurring those lines. That's where the problems arise. That's where the warning kind of signals pop up here, is you have to be very clear in the employment relationship, right? How is it going to happen? Are you W-2? Are you at will? Can you quit tomorrow? Or do you have a notice provision in your contract that says you must give me 30 days, right? That's how I would describe it.
Got it. Yeah. I think, the whole idea of the contract, when you have a contract with a contractor, it should definitely be time-based, 6 months, 1 year or something, and there's another signing. It's not this kind of indefinite thing like it could be with an employee,
Correct.
Right?
I've seen both. I am much more comfortable with year to year where, okay, we're going to sign a new contract now, right? The contract's up. If you want to renew, here's another contract, sign this contract, and we start, the contract starts again. Not, okay, I'm just going to renew it. If you don't disagree, then we'll just continue having you work here indefinitely until you want to terminate the contract. Because that goes to the argument of, well, that sounds to me like W-2 then, right? Mm-hmm. That's my concern with those type of contracts. Yeah.
And if a contractor is providing supervision, making sure that there's a separate contract for that.
Yeah, supervision contract is critically important. If you have a contract supervisor and they're doing something in addition to providing clinical therapy to you, they're providing any other service to you, that needs to be, and they are a contractor, in my opinion, you need to have a contract for that. Right. I've seen ones where someone will bring to me and say, okay, I'm hiring this person as a contractor, and they're going to do front desk work, and they're going to help me with social media, and they're going to help me with this, and they're going to help me with that. And I'm like, no, that cannot happen. We cannot do that. Right. What's their job duties? What specifically do you want them to do? I want them to do all that. Great. Hire them as an employee. Because your contract, the point of the contract is to say, you're going to do plumbing. You're going to fix my sink, and I'm going to pay you $500. Great. You're going to come in, you're going to do clinical therapy, right? Great. I'm going to give you X amount of percentage of every session you hold. Great. For a year.
That's right.
Perfect. Set terms. If you want them then to do something else, then you need to you need to have them sign a contract to do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Right, yeah, because you can't tell the plumber like, hey, yeah, and I also need you to go pick up my kids after school,
right.
and like all these other things.
Wait, your RDs
He's like, well, that's
rates,
an extra.
my RDs rates. I also need laundry folded. So while you're here and waiting, can you just help me fold laundry?
That's right. That's right. Oh, I think we're done with the plumbing analogy on that point. All right. So the things we talked about the overhead, like the idea of what a contractor and employee is. Then we talked about the risks of misclassifying, the financial risks that you have that you can incur. And then the third thing we talked about was how the IRS, the common law, the rules in which they kind of determine what a contractor is. And so those are the big three things. And I'm looking at if there's any other questions here. But actually, you know what? Before we get to the final questions, I do have one more announcement here. And before we go on, I do want to remind the listeners about a free resource you can take advantage of today. If you're a mental health professional and you want to start your own practice, but you don't know where to begin, I put together a free step-by-step launch guide, and it's a checklist that I use to launch and grow over 10 brand new private practices with my clients over the past 5 years. It's a very detailed checklist that's easy to follow, and there's links to dozens of how-to videos that I've created to help you along the way. You just go to brandyourpractice.com/checklist. Look, every airline pilot follows a pre-flight checklist, and every astronaut follows a launch checklist. If you're going to launch your website or your practice, download my free checklist today at brandyourpractice.com/checklist. Man, Dan, this has been like a feast of information. So thank you for all the a lot of information. Before we kind of wrap up a couple of questions I have here, I just want to follow up on how can people find more about you and what you do?
Sure. So you can always go to our webpage, www. It's my name, DanielMayerLaw.com. It's Mayer. You can also, like was said, I have a podcast. You can go to our podcast webpage. It's protectingyourpractice.com. You can contact me at simply, just really, make it simple. Just contact us at admin. So ADMIN at DanielMayerLaw.com. We are on Facebook and Instagram as well. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Let's see here. A couple follow-up questions, and we'll let our listeners go. What do employers have to abide by for paid days off? So for example, this is from my wife. I wanted to know about this. So Christmas is on a Sunday this year. But the designated day off is a Monday. Does that Monday count as personal time off, or does that actually count as like the federal holiday or whatever?
Well, if you're in private practice, right, I would generally say you can set whatever hours you want. Now, whether you're not going to have people come in on Christmas Day, no, probably not, right? Certainly banks might be closed on a federal holiday, but like I'll give you an example that came up recently was, for something like Veterans Day or things like that, there are lots of businesses that are open. It's still a federal holiday. It's really going to come down to, if you're doing employees, what your hours. I see handbooks where, and I think it's a good idea, where you lay out exactly what are the actual set holidays that the office is closing on. Okay, you lay those out, and then then you have your paid leave. In Maryland, for example, if you're under a certain number of employees, you can do unpaid leave. And then you have your paid or unpaid leave hours, and if someone wants to take off that day, they can. And you can certainly set how much notice they have to give you and things like that. But I do think that these are tricky, and when you have something like, Christmas falls on a Saturday, but really, what about Monday? Or New Year's falls on a Saturday, but what about New Year's Day, which falls on a Monday, or whatever it is, I think as an employer, you need to take that into account. When it comes to contractors, as we said, like, you're out of luck. Like, if the contractor says, I'm not coming in, it's New Year's Day, okay,
right.
They're not going to get paid, but they're not coming in. You can't tell them, sorry, I need you here, right? But an employee, sure, right? Like, look, it's July 4th, I know, but July 3rd, it's a Friday today. I really need everyone in the office today to get everything done before the holiday weekend. You can do that.
Got it. That's it. That's the only follow-up question I have. That was really helpful. Okay. So just have the employer, if you're an employer, just set in your handbook, these are the days that the offices are going to be closed.
I look at the handbook, so clinicians, so you can understand this, I look at the handbook kind of like the same way that you look at the informed consent when you give your clients. Why do you give clients informed consent? I always go back to this with clinicians. It's informed consent. You want them to be as informed as possible so they can make a decision as to whether to retain your services to do therapy with them. So you need to give them as much information as you want so they can make that decision. With employees, I think that's the same thing with a handbook. You set the policies that you want the employees to know, to be accountable to, right? And you put that in writing so that if an employee doesn't follow that, right, then you have the opportunity to follow up and say, these are our policies. They were written in advance. You were given them, notice of it. It's very clear to everyone what the rules are, and you can also set that in your offer letter when you're hiring an employee.
Yeah.
Hey, we offer, all the major holidays, we're closed, so you don't have to worry about that. Give that kind of information to employees. The more information you give to employees, the more they'll be able to comply with your expectations about what's needed.
Ah, awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, and please be sure to go check out the podcast that Daniel mentioned, protectingyourpractice.com, and then danielmayerlaw.com. But all right, folks, thanks for hanging in there. If you found the conversation useful, subscribe to the podcast, and please join me for the next time on the next episode of the Brand Your Practice podcast.